Thank you, Stephanie. Great job for a non-morning person. I hope I can rise to the occasion as a fellow evening person. Really delighted to be back here at this conference. Thanks so much for having me. Just because I'm from Washington doesn't mean that I don't believe in accountability. So, with that spirit, let me tell you, 8 years ago, when I had the pleasure of addressing this audience, it was about half the size, so kudos to you folks for that. Great work with that. I think most analysts and observers thought that the aerospace business would be lockstep with the rest of the world economy and suffer exactly the kind of debilitating blow that we saw across the board in the business. And I'm, I guess, somewhat embarrassed to say that I was half wrong, and I'm very sorry to say that the half I was right about concerns you. The industry, as you can see in that blue line, the civil line, well, the military line doesn't really change a whole heck of a lot, truth be told, but the civil line shows output, and it actually grew at a faster pace after the economic meltdown than it did before. Are there exceptions? Yes, and I'm afraid Wichita was kind of the center of the exception. So when I was here 8 years ago, I was wrong about there being a coming global downturn, but I was right about there being a Wichita downturn. Falls under the heading of when bad things happen to good people. Moving forward, as you'll see in a moment, I've got a lot of comments about the future. Obviously, it's what my address is about. But I'm confident that despite the current weakness we're seeing in markets, Wichita is sort of at the other end of it. I think you guys look fairly better protected. But looking at the past 8 years, it's been a huge blow, as I'm sure many of you have experienced and seen with your own eyes. Let me walk you through a few of the things that just happened and what I think is about to happen now. First of all, as you can see, there's that growth rate. The civil market did fantastically well. This is way too much data. My wife hates it when I replace the screensaver I have of our children on my computer with this, but it's the only way I manage to keep track of all the numbers as they move. The first column shows the compound annual growth rate and output by the various segments of the aerospace industry. And as you can see, 03 to 08 were just great years, as they were for most of the economy, as all of you know. And then weird stuff happened in 08, 09, and weird stuff happened in this industry, 13, 14, 14, 15. If you look at this industry from the standpoint of big commercial jetliners, that's that top line, which make up about 55% of output in this business, that's the sort of global weirding we experienced. Commercial jetliner deliveries accelerated for a variety of reasons, whereas business aircraft, which of course the air capital of the world specialize in, got clobbered. And they not only got clobbered across the board, they especially, actually purely got clobbered in the small and medium cabin aircraft that Cessna, Hawker, and Lear specialize in. Now, you probably know that Spirit did okay, and that was because their exposure is 99% at that top line there. But the business aircraft side effectively hit red ink. You can see that second line there, I put that there, fell by a pretty nasty CAGR at the bottom line, and you'll see in a moment. And right now, there appears to be another downturn too. First of all, a brief history of the business aircraft market that, of course, has also served to drive Wichita's fortunes for many years, going back to the early 1960s. I was born in '63, so I started collecting records in '64. You can see that that's the first year. You know, basically, you look at the dollar value of output, we were kind of a flat Sargasso Sea. You know, I mean, things went up a little bit. We all experienced cycles in the industry way back then, but then there were two remarkable periods of transformation, second half of the 90s and then 03, 08, that brought the industry to about 30 billion plus a year, an incredible transformation. And then look what happened over the past 8 years since I last had the pleasure of addressing you here. The dollar value more or less came back, but units did not. Basically, if you were building large cabin jets, which unfortunately Wichita does not, you did okay. If you build small and medium cabinets, which Wichita is the world leading center of, you got clobbered. Let me show you this bifurcation. For some reason, actually probably myriad good reasons, for many decades, the top half of the market, that's jets that cost $26 million and above, pretty much traveled in lockstep in terms of market success with the bottom stuff, the Cessnas, the Hawkers, the Lears. And then all of a sudden you had this huge rip in the market. After '08, the big cabin stuff, your Gulfstreams, your Bombardiers, your Dassauts, actually did just fine. They even grew. And that's because a lot of their exposure is to emerging markets, the BRIC countries, energy-producing countries, energy-producing companies, all over the world, but really not so much North America and not so much the traditional economy companies that rely on business jets to reach distribution portals and new markets and things like that. That bottom half of the market, I've never seen anything like this in 30 years of studying this business. A 57% market collapse in a mature segment. They don't teach you that in forecasting school, I can tell you. And that was exactly the blow that Wichita took just after I had the pleasure of addressing you in 2008. Basically, the aerospace industry did just fine after '08, except for this, that red line there at the bottom. And that's what happened to Wichita. So I broke it down by Wichita versus the rest of the world, and you can see that, obviously, you look back at the peak, 92 to 95, Wichita produced over half of the world's business jets by value. In 2015, it was only 14%. And a couple of factors drove that. Most of it was that bifurcation between small jets and larger jets. Another, of course, was the arrival of Embraer from Brazil as a very serious competitor in that small and mid-sized segment. These were the two factors that really damaged. Now, one good thing I can say, 2015, for the first time in years, we began to see recovery in Wichita. Industry restructuring, of course, with Cessna acquiring Hawker Beechcraft, Cessna itself coming back, Textron to a certain extent coming back. There are still some question marks over, say, Learjet's future, but it was welcome to see a slight inflection point last year. It looks like we'll see a little bit more of the same in 2016. Here's what I said about those top half deliveries. Basically, there's a bit of a correlation between oil prices and demand for big jets. And right now, you're actually seeing a fairly profound impact. 2016 is just the start of it. You'll see a significant reduction in large cabin jet deliveries in 2017, maybe 2018 too. We're going into a down cycle. The good news is this does not really impact Wichita at all. As I mentioned, Wichita is purely in that small and mid-sized cabin, so it's really a different dynamic. The part of the business that's feeling pain is not the Wichita part right now. Historically, yes. One thing you do have to watch out for is that the trend is increasingly towards larger cabin jets. That's exactly what you'd expect when you've got more and more emerging markets playing a bigger role in taking aircraft, be it the BRIC countries or the Mint countries, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey, and whatever other acronyms that economists come up with for emerging market countries. The good news is that I think Cessna, the dominant player here, of course, recognizes this. They're moving upscale with the Longitude and Hemisphere, trying to get into those upper brackets of the business jet segment. Moving forward, here's what we're expecting in terms of market share. Cessna is making a bit of a recovery. Like I said, over the last 10 years, they were 13.5%. They're going to about 15%. I think they're doing the right thing in terms of new product development. Hawker, of course, you can see, second column from the left, simply died, and that's very sad. This doesn't include their turboprop market share, which is doing just great. Their market share was effectively taken by Embraer. You can see that they're second from the left, going from 2.5 to 8.2. The good news is that Embraer's inroads into the market seem to have hit a wall. They had a tremendous first few years, but in terms of what to do next, I think they're probably a little undecided. There don't appear to be a whole lot of opportunities, especially since Cessna isn't as weak as it was a few years back. Now, turning over to the big jetliner side of things that, of course, drive Spirit fortunes, and, of course, many of the fortunes of the companies that produce bits and pieces and chunks and structures for this industry. This is an enormously complex supply chain, as you might imagine, for an enterprise that's worth over $100 billion a year in new deliveries. So the number of Wichita-based companies that play a role in that is, of course, quite huge. Once upon a time, we had cyclicality in this business. That is to say, we'd have the traditional economic cycles of 7 good years, 3 bad years. It was like that all the way since the dawn of the jet age, which was 5 years before I was born, so I inherited these numbers. But look what happened over the last 12 years. We had this super cycle. It wasn't 7 good years, 3 bad years. It was 12 great years with a 9% plus compound annual growth rate. That was an extraordinary transformation of this business, and a lot of it was of huge benefit to Spirit Aerosystems because, of course, they're exposed to some of the more important programs. Obviously, they built the entire body of the 737. Where are we now? The aviation business is in better shape than you might think. You look at airlines, they've obviously found a way to, amazingly enough, make money, which is something I also thought I'd never live to see. Traffic has been pretty strong lately. It's coming in at about 5.5, 5.6% growth year over year. In other words, people are flying and airlines are making money. The only question is not, hey, are we headed for a bus cycle? But rather, how long can we sustain the kind of crazy growth rates we've seen in the jetliner business before we suffer overcapacity? If you look at that thin red line up there, that's available seat kilometers. That's capacity in the airline business. It's kind of putting its nose a little bit, getting a little bit ahead of RPKs. That's demand, revenue passenger kilometers, people paying to fly planes. A little concerned there, particularly since yields are falling to a certain extent some places. There's a real threat to load factors on some international long haul. Now, a bottom line for you, the good news from Wichita's standpoint is that the real concern with passenger demand, the real concern with overcapacity in the jetliner business has very little to do with the narrow bodies, the single aisle jets, which of course Spirit Aerosystems, that's their bread and butter, the 737. Most of the problem is focused in the twin aisles, the wide bodies for international routes. Spirit does some there, 787 most notably, but a lot of their work is elsewhere, of course, outside of Wichita on the A350 and other programs. So you're going to see a bit of a bifurcation, I think, here too, with the single aisles doing pretty good and the twin aisles maybe, if not taking a hit, then at least, well, reaching the end of growth. You look at orders and deliveries, it's not been the best year. As a business, we've had some crazy, insane book-to-bill ratios over the past decade, 2.5, 3 to 1. You know, all businesses should have this problem, right? We now have a backlog of about 11,000 jetliners with production running at about 1,500 per year. Again, all businesses should have these problems. But from the standpoint of orders, which of course a lot of people care about, you have seen a reduction this year. You're looking at a book-to-bill ratio of below 1 to 1 for the first time in about 5 years. Book-to-bill is going to be about 0.7. So in other words, we're seeing a slowdown, not seeing a hit, not seeing a bus cycle, not seeing that awaited 3-year downturn, but we are seeing a slowdown here, particularly on twin aisles. Now, what caused all these great numbers and why did Spirit do so good and Boeing and Airbus did? It's another funny quirk of our economic universe that during the great years of 2008 on, I shouldn't say great, let's face it, they were not great, but we had this weird, for the first time ever, we had a recession and resource prices stayed pretty darn high. Normally demand falls, so of course prices fall. But here we had oil prices reaching new heights despite this economic fall off in the world. And at the same time, interest rates, the cost of capital, which normally for many decades, for some reason fluctuated with the price of fuel, you had the price of cash basically collapse. In other words, you had central banks around the globe begging you to show up with a wheelbarrow and take all the money you wanted at a 0% interest rate. Please build more wheelbarrows. Now, what does this mean from an airline standpoint? Well, think about it in the past. If you had high fuel prices, you'd love to replace those old jetliners, but you couldn't afford the interest rates on, because most of your jets are going to be financed by somebody else. It was like trying to get a mortgage in the Carter administration. Interest rates were crazy. And then if interest rates were cheap and you could afford new jets, why would you bother? Fuel was cheap too. So why replace anything? Just keep your DC-9s, who cares? For the first time in the history of the jet age, for the past 8 years, you had airlines given the incentive to refleet, to replace those older, thirstier jets, and you had the cheap cash with which to do so. So this drove this tremendous bull market in the jetliner business. Now, one thing I am concerned about, an awful lot of this, of course, went to those BRIC countries. Looking at the world economy today, however, it's a different story. There is no BRIC miracle. There's only the K miracle. Brazil, Russia, India, they've ceased taking jets. They've ceased really being the engine of world economic growth. It's down to China. They're doing great. Thank you, China. They're now taking 22% of jetliners. That is a record. They have displaced the US as the biggest single jetliner market. Can that keep going? Well, that's the big question, because if you're Airbus and Boeing and planning on further production increases, it's pretty obvious that China has to keep ramping up. And given the trends in China, I don't think they're going to get much above this level, 300 J planes or so per year. Certainly nothing about their GDP growth rates imply that they're going to really get to 28%, 30%, or something like that of output. So another reason I think we're going to hit a bit of a plateau in the next couple of years. Now, the problem is that Airbus and Boeing are currently providing this level of guidance. That is to say, the next 5 years, they want to resemble the last 12 years. They want to keep going. I'm not so sure that's going to happen. So when you hear expectations of continued growth at this miraculous 9.2% CAGR, I take them with a grain of salt. Our expectation is that there's a relatively minor correction coming sometime around 2021, but up until then, we've got a bit of further growth. Now, again, there's a split here. You look within this jetliner market, and you'll see growth in wide bodies, the twin aisles, hitting a wall this year, whereas the single aisle, 737 and A320, they're going to keep ramping up, keep the market growing at a slightly slower, a muted growth rate through about 2020, and then you'll see a bit of a minor correction, but I don't think it's going to be terrible. Now, the good news is, of course, again, Spirit doing the 737 and lots of people doing work on the A320 for Airbus. Those are the two programs that drive the single aisle market segment. Now, this is the best run duopoly on the planet, I can tell you that. Boeing and Airbus do, despite their warts, despite their flaws, they do a great job keeping out newcomers. Bombardier is the adorable little orange slice there from Canada, there to the right. They've got a very nice jet called the C Series. It's on the verge of bankrupting them. It's really tough to break into this market. I think the C Series will get through somehow, miraculously, with a lot of Canadian government intervention. We're talking billions of dollars, but I think they'll do it. But breaking into this Airbus and Boeing duopoly has basically become virtually impossible. And as a result, that's pretty much our expectation moving forward. You see that little yellow wedge in the middle? There's an opportunity in the middle of the market, basically jets that are somewhere between 200 and 240 seats. Boeing, of course, there's a lot of talk about a new jet and whether or not it'll be launched in the next couple of years, and obviously with Spirit and other aerostructures companies bidding for chunks and pieces of it. But it's just as possible that Airbus goes after that. Either way, very well-run duopoly. Turning now to the defense side of things. You might remember a couple of years ago, there was a lot of talk about the Budget Control Act, about sequestration, and all these other things that were really going to clobber the defense budget. Well, you can pretty much forget about that. Whoever's president, it's looking like it's a solid market. You look at that middle line, that's the procurement budget, the budget that actually buys weaponry. We rounded out FY14 with a low of about 101 billion a year. We're now heading to the 1-teens, maybe the 120s. There's actually a lot of competition among most of the politicians involved to actually talk even bigger numbers. So I think, if anything, we've got a solid growth market here on the defense budget. In terms of combat aircraft, as you know, the Joint Strike Fighter is the big driver. If you look at that bottom maroon slice, that's US procurement, which has kind of hit a shelf because this plane is seriously expensive. It costs about 110, 120 million in unit recurring flyaway. The checked slice above that is international demand for the F-35, which is happily ramping up. And I say happily because I think the US military is hoping that the 7 or 8 international customers so far do their part in making this ramp up happen. That program is going to get to be about 50–55% of the combat aircraft market by the end of the decade. Just above that, you have undetermined planes. After that, you've got European planes, Russian planes, rest of world planes, etc. Those undetermined planes are hugely important because, frankly, your neighbors in St. Louis heavily depend upon competitions. I did this before the announcement a couple days ago that it looks like the administration is going to approve F-15 sales to Qatar, 36 of them, and 28 F-A-18s to Kuwait. That's a lifeline to St. Louis. In order for Boeing St. Louis fighter production facilities to stay alive, they really need to start winning export contests like those. So this is really solid news for them. That takes those production lines into the early 2020s with additional purchases from the US military and other foreign customers. So St. Louis is kind of living hand to mouth. Fort Worth is doing great because of the F-35. But in terms of St. Louis, they really depend upon those export contests to survive at this point. Now, there are some changes in the US military the US military industrial base for exports and for domestic purposes. You might call this the everybody dies chart. Right now, there's an awful lot of programs being threatened by production cuts and by, well, market share changes and whatever else. Big mauve over there, of course, is the F-35. Everything else that's in production right now, be it the F-15, F-16, F-A-18, C-17, the last C-17, which is also the last jet built in California, was delivered earlier this year. Bit of a milestone, rather sad one in my mind. The only thing that's really slated to definitely survive is the C-130J. That's been in production since 1954. My father-in-law flew it in Vietnam. 25th century archaeologists will find the production line active somewhere. Nothing can stop that aircraft, and that's good. Built in Marietta, Georgia. Above Big Mauve over there, you've got a new trainer, the Trainer Experimental TX from the Air Force. There are 4 companies bidding for that. We'll see who wins. And on top of that, there's the new bomber, which is turning into a real program. Northrop Grumman won it with the B-21 Raider last year. You're going to see metal or composites or whatever being cut sometime in the coming couple of years, and probably a big scramble for aerostructures work too related to that. They're going to build at least 100, maybe 175 by some accounts. Boeing. I think they used to have a big facility here, if I'm not mistaken. They face a real challenge, a very serious challenge. Because, as I mentioned, their legacy combat aircraft programs are dying. They might be prolonged a little bit by Qatar, Kuwait, and whatever else into the early 2020s. But after that, their production is shifting to military derivatives of commercial jetliners, particularly the P-8, which is a maritime patrol and submarine hunting plane based on the 737, built here in Wichita, and the KC-46, which is a tanker aircraft built on the 767, formerly built here in Wichita, but no longer. It's now modified up in Washington State. But after that, they face a real challenge. They lost the bomber program. They're only one of 4 companies involved in the trainer program. Boeing faces very serious challenges ahead to maintain a presence in the military aircraft business. There's a real risk that the company becomes effectively a pure play commercial jetliner manufacturer. Trainers. Wichita's role in this is in the bottom slice, that prop side. That's where the T6 plays, and the T6 is still going pretty well. The U.S. military has stopped procuring it, but it's doing pretty well with export contracts. Looks like it'll be able to keep alive for another few years, and probably for the end of our forecast, to the tune of about 2 per month or something along those lines. Above that, jets, there's that TX program right above that, where Wichita will probably play some kind of aerostructures role, maybe if 1 or 2 of the teams win. It's hard to tell at this point. Turning now to Rotorcraft, this is one of those strange stories. You can see that U.S. military procurement of helicopters ramped up hugely over the last 10 years, in line with, of course, the use of these machines in Iraq and Afghanistan. The problem is this has served to burn through the existing programs of record, so you're watching numbers soften too. Look at that orange line. That's the market for civil helicopters. And this year, that's taken a hell of a blow. That's primarily due to low oil and gas prices, which has really clobbered demand for the super mid-size cabin planes. And then on top of that, military international, which has been pretty consistently strong and will stay pretty consistently strong. Now, summing it all up, aircraft production, where are we? Well, last 10 years, next 10 years. Again, the big growth driver here is really those big commercial jets. And it looks like when we've got growth through 2020, that's what'll keep things going. It looks like the total industry for building planes will probably top out at about $210 billion a year. That's just the final price of delivering jets. You look at the industrial base, of which Wichita has a very, very big presence. You look at the industrial base, its actual turnover, its actual total value is somewhere between $1/2 and $3/4 trillion a year. So and that excludes support, sustainment, training and services, airlines, airports, all that other stuff. Aircraft manufacturing is a huge import to the world economy, and especially to Wichita. Now, one thing about this program is that, about this industry, is that volume is hugely important. As many of you know, being on the manufacturing side, it's all about volume. And this is an industry where the top 20 programs are over 75% of industry output. And you look at the 2 top ones, the Airbus A320 and the Boeing 737, this chart shows you the last 10 years of revenue and what we anticipate being the next 10 years of revenue. Good news is that Wichita has very heavy levels of exposure to that second line, the 737 family. The entire body, as I mentioned, is built here, and plenty of others that are in part built by companies in Wichita. But if you are a subcontractor in this business, it is absolutely essential to be on one of the top 6 or 7 programs, because volume trails off markedly as soon as you come down from those first few planes. If I have the pleasure of addressing you for one quick elevator ride, an elevator that holds 700 people amazingly, this is what I tell you about each and every market very quickly. Large jetliners, this is a flat year. It's tough to derail the ramp, but I think wide bodies are taking a blow. Single aisles, they're going to keep going. Business aircraft, you're going to see further damage, but none of it's going to be in Wichita. All of the damage moving forward is going to be in Savannah, Georgia, Marignan, France, where Dassault is, and Montreal, Canada, which is where Bombardier is. The bottom half of the market, the small and mid-sized cabin, those look fine. So I think the serious body blow that Wichita took from business aircraft since I last had the pleasure of speaking here, that's a thing of the past. It's not going to happen. Things are stabilizing. Regionals, nothing really happens in that market. Civil rotorcraft is just a disaster right now, just because of oil prices. Everything else, military markets look fine. They really do. Those are green in terms of risk. Civil rotorcraft, that's the only red we've got. I'm real scared about that thing staying real weak for a very long time. Again, depending upon what happens with oil prices. Total industry this year is downshifting with a bit more risk, but again, I think Wichita is pretty well insulated from that risk. And with that, I think I'm finishing up right on time. Thank you for your attention.